Hey guys, I wanted to make a video about the most recent tuning changes to Mage for all three specs, Fire, Frost, and Arcane, and what to expect basically going forward to Shadowlands with these changes, or not Shadowlands, sorry, Dragonflight with the changes, and what we can look forward to in the future. So to start off, I'm going to talk about Fire, and then Frost, then Arcane. So, if you're only interested in Arcane, feel free to skip ahead. But the most recent changes were for Fire and Frost. For Fire, it was Ignite damage reduced by 12%, and Master of Flame now increases Ignite damage by 15 instead of 18. And these changes are specifically aimed at nerfing Fire in Mythic Plus in AoE settings. It's not a massive nerf for single target, but it is definitely still a nerf on single target because Ignite is it's a decent chunk of our single target. Um, so what does this mean? Unfortunately, it makes Fire worse, as you can imagine, in dungeons. Um, but there's a kind of positive involved here. And I'm going to switch over to the talent tree just to kind of give an example. So when we look at the talent tree right now and what options Fire Mages have, it's very typical that we'll go down a route like this, right? We'll grab these, and then maybe we'll grab Master of Flame in Dragonflight, and then maybe get one more point, maybe slap it here, maybe slap it here. Doesn't really matter. But the problem that we have is that we are incredibly powerful on AoE by design. And what I mean by that is that, if you're in Blizzard's position, if you make fire mages strong in single target, then their AoE will be crazy because their AoE scales off their single target. But if that's the case, then you can never make them strong on single target, or they'll just be absurd on AoE. I've mentioned in the past that one way to fix this is to actually buff hyperthermia to make it so that it's a more attractive choice on single target. The reason behind this is that hyperthermia gives you non-hot streak pyroblasts. Hot streak pyroblasts are twice as powerful of an ignite due to the buff that hot streak is. It increases ignite damage by 100% from the pyroblast. But Blizzard has gone to a different approach, basically a more lazy approach in my opinion, but at least part one of that approach, which I'll kind of get into in a second. But they've nerfed Ignite and Master of Flame. Currently, Master of Flame is not amazing on live, but in Dragonflight it's quite decent. Main reason is that it says, deals X% more damage while combustion is not active. And what it means by this is that spells cast outside of combustion give 18% more ignite, essentially. So, building an ignite and then leaving combustion doesn't buff the ignite suddenly. It's just your spells will contribute more when they're out of combustion. But in Dragonflight, because of the fact that, we're going to be outside of combustion more often, because of, we just have less gear, so we have less haste, so less combustions. But also the fact that we have access to less fire blasts makes the second part more valuable. So nerfing this is kind of like a preemptive move on Blizzard's hand, and then also nerfing Ignite. Now the good thing is, between these nerfs, is the fact that nerfing our AoE damage specifically by looking at how our AoE works, which is Ignite spreading, it increases the potential to be able to buff fire on single targets. Now, when they buff our single target, if they buff the single target, fingers crossed, that means our AoE won't be insanely problematic, as easily. So I kind of see this as like part one of a nerf. Hopefully, I'm smoking a little hopium here. But yeah, that's the hope. On a note, because Ignite has been nerfed on single target and AoE, basically it starts to value hyperthermia, like I mentioned in the past, a little bit more, and it starts to devalue things like Fiery Rush, where you're really banking on building big ignites with more fire blasts and stuff. So I wouldn't be surprised if hyperthermia gains power. And initial sims so far have been showing that to be the case. It has crept up a lot closer to Fiery Rush than it was in the past. I'm not completely sold on whether it's the best choice yet, but don't be super surprised if it turns out to be the case. Moving on to Frost Mage, I'm not a Frost Mage connoisseur, but I know quite a bit about the spec. The nerfs are very simple. Frozen Orb is, your largest damage contributor in AoE. Blizzard does not fall too far behind. Basically, it's just an aura damage nerf, essentially, right? It targets our AoE a bit more. Frozen Orb, yes, increases our single target a little bit, but not an insane amount. Wouldn't worry about single target too much. But definitely a nerf on AoE. Um, and yeah, just kind of weakens Frost Mage. Not much more to say about that, unfortunately. One thing you could mention is that this nerf potentially favors builds that do not revolve around spawning, crazy amounts of orbs. So maybe it will, favor things more like Fractured Frost or whatever, or like more of our icicle damage it becomes more primary in our AoE rotation. Unfortunately, though, the Frost tree overall does not support gameplay outside of Frozen Orb, just because there's not enough things that buff our AoE damage, like, in terms of like Frost Bolts and Flurries and Ice Lances, specifically for AoE. An example of what I'm thinking about is like the Necroloid form, where similar to Fractured Frost, you had a higher chance to spawn more and more Frostbolt cleaves. The Necrolord form was 100%. This is a 50% at 2 points. And also Necrolord obviously gave us the spell power buff. This does not. Yeah, so there's just a lot of problems here for Frost when it's just tuned too low. I'm not saying that Frost is tuned too low for what it's worth. I still think it could be competitive, but this nerf unfortunately does set them back a little bit. But yeah, not too complicated of a nerf. The last thing I want to talk about is actually the Arcane buffs. Now, in my last video, I mentioned how Arcane will basically only be good in niche situations, and it's kind of the weird kid in high school that nobody wanted to talk to. This kid just got a lot of clout. He got buffed. Arcane blast damage increased by 8%, missiles by 5, explosion by 12, and that's a huge one. Orb by 10 also is very big, and barrage by 8 is also very big. So, at first look, what this seems is that they want to basically, buff missiles a little bit, do some due diligence, but not buff it too much because we don't want to go back into spamming missiles like we did in Kyrian, Arcane, and Shadowlands. Buffing blast and barrage a little bit as well does definitely, is a nod to our single target. But Arcane's AoE is mostly around explosion, orb, and barrage. And the buffs being heavily weighted to that is very, very good for Arcane's Mythic Plus gameplay style. Barrage also does, as I mentioned, does buff our single target, and Blast actually does buff our AoE because of Harmonic Echo, which allows our spells to cleave essentially during Radiant Spark, and those spells will be Arcane Blasts. Buffing Arcane Blast certainly does help that out. So that's a good nod towards Arcane. And, from these buffs and nerfs that have come through and from my testing, Arcane actually, believe it or not, is my choice of preference now for Mythic Plus. I've played around with it a little bit in Mythic Plus. I played with it in Raid quite a bit actually, and I had a great time. Did quite competitive damage. Mythic Plus, once again, quite competitive damage. It wasn't quite on the level of like a Havoc Demon Hunter or like a Windwalker Monk, even after their quote-unquote nerfs. But definitely outperforming Fire and Arcane, I would say. And what's great about that is that Arcane actually does quite well on single target with the exact same build, which is something that a lot of people don't think about. A lot of times we'll see these videos and these people like hyping up their specs, and they'll talk about their crazy AoE build that does insane AoE damage, like, Affliction Warlocks will say this kind of stuff. And then you look at them on single target with their AoE build, and they're like absolutely useless. Arcane does not suffer from that issue. Arcane has great single target and great AoE in the same build, and that's an amazing thing. I've crafted like a talent tree here. I'm not going to go into too much because I'm actually going to have a video that, basically is an Arcane Mage guide amongst other guides. But essentially it will look something like this. We can grab Arcane Tempo, we grab Orb. But the most important thing is the Arcane Echo that we grab over here does AoE damage. Nether Tempest does a bit of AoE damage too. Harmonic Echo is huge for AoE. This point here, Arcane Explosion and Blast by 20% is very strong for AoE as well. This point here actually is not bad in AoE either. It basically gives us 10% haste for free, essentially, on AoE. Note that this is basically every time you consume charges, not every charge. So it's, you consume 4 charges, you get 2%. Do that 5 times, you'll get to 10. It's not consume 4 and get 8. That's why it's not very good in single target. Also, you don't barrage much in single target. But in AoE, you do this often. So this is a great talent for AoE. But yeah, overall, this build actually is very similar. If you were to change this to be a single target build, it would literally just be this. That's the only change you'd really make. you'd still grab Siphon Storm, you'd still grab Harmonic Echo, you'd still grab Arcane Harmony, still grab everything else the exact same. It's literally just that one point. And that one point is like 10% Arcane Missile damage, or what, like 5% haste? Um, or sorry, 10% haste? It's, it's very minor. So yeah, Arcane is looking quite powerful. And I'll get into that in a guide, be on the lookout. I should be uploading it soon. But yeah, closing remarks. Arcane stunks very high right now. Probably the best spec to play for Mythic Plus. Fire and Frost certainly took a hit. Frost is kind of just a tuning knob. If they're strong numerically, it'll be good. Right now, they're not quite there yet. Fire, it's like I hope that I see it as a part 1 nerf to a part 2 buff where they buff our single target. That'll be a great spot for Fire to be in, I think, from a gameplay and design perspective. But, without that buff, obviously, we still suffer a little bit. But yeah, let me know your thoughts. If you disagree with something I said, or you agree with what I said, feel free to leave a comment. And yeah, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one.